Hello, my name's Andy. Welcome to episode 71 of Keeping Water. In this week's episode, we're going to begin my look at predators by starting with the most common and prolific, the heron. Most pond keepers will have, at least, had a heron or herons visit their pond. Depending on a variety of factors, they will either continuously visit occasionally, or rarely if ever. Those factors may make the difference to a pond keeper losing all their fish, some or none. A heron that can easily catch fish from a pond will return constantly until there's no more left to catch. Herons have to rely on problem solving, determination and perseverance in the wild to catch their prey, and will apply all of those qualities to catching pond fish, especially when fish are harder to catch in later autumn, winter and early spring in the wild, when ponds will provide both an easy meal and a high volume of food in a small area. What I think is important to remember when considering the predators that visit our gardens is that they're just doing what their instinct and need to eat and live dictates. As much as we may be attached to our fish, they have no greater right to live than any local predator does. We build our ponds knowing that those predators are around, that they'll visit our garden, and it's up to us to do what we can to protect our fish, which doesn't include, morally or legally, harming animals that are just doing what their nature tells them to. Protecting fish from herons in a garden pond is problematic to say the least, and not at all easy. The method may differ depending on the type of pond you have, formal or natural, raised or ground level, etc. In addition, how we want our ponds to look may affect what we choose to do. And finally, of course, what we can afford to do will also impact how secure we can make things. Before I go through the many options there are to dissuade or prevent herons from hunting in your pond, I think it's important to say that for as many people who say a particular method will work, there'll be many who will describe how herons have managed to find ways round it. The first of many approaches is to place a fake heron by the side of the pond. The thinking is that herons tend to hunt solitarily and would avoid places where another heron is already looking for prey. These clearly don't always work, and there's a number of probable reasons why. Firstly, they may not look that real to another heron. Pond keepers will intermittently change their position, but while herons are quite famous for remaining still, it's unlikely that the utterly immobile plastic bird will always be convincing. Secondly, herons can be quite sociable and will nest and rest together, and although they tend to hunt separately, they will also tolerate each other, especially when prey are abundant. Lastly, desperation for food will make most predators take risks, and if a heron takes a risk and lands close to another one, which then does nothing, it will probably stop being nervous. The next approach is to add more aversive methods, for instance automated water sprays and electric fencing. Like fake herons, they will put off herons from approaching the pond. However, it does not take too long searching on YouTube to find videos of herons appearing unbothered by both being sprayed with water and touching electric cables. I would guess that in both cases the drive to eat overrides any discomfort they experience. I think it's easy to not appreciate how desperate animals get in the wild when hungry, and once they take a risk and find it's possible to get to the fish without too many problems, they're likely to return and feed without concern. The next approach is to cover the pond with a rigid frame or a net. The pros are that it obviously makes it a lot harder, although not impossible as we'll see in a bit, for the herons to get at the fish. The cons are that it can ruin the look of the pond as a whole and spoil your view of the fish, which might seem like a necessary evil if they were 100% effective. However, they're not. Again, only brief Googling will find examples of herons both walking on netting, grabbing fish through netting, and while not always able to get the fish through the grid or net, they can still injure or even kill them. Which brings me, eventually, to the method I've chosen. In deciding what to do, I did consider how I wanted the pond to look. I didn't want it permanently covered, for instance. I certainly didn't want to employ methods like a water spray, and definitely not electric fencing. And anyway, none of them, as I've spoken about, are that effective anyway. So I needed to find an approach which wouldn't impact my view of the water and would actually be as effective as possible. My starting point was to try to know more about herons, what type of bird they are, how they behave and how they hunt, hoping that, by understanding them more, I could choose a better approach. So, with that in mind, I'll share some of the information I found and explain how that led me to the decision I made. The grey heron is native throughout temperate Europe, Asia and parts of Africa. It tends to be resident in much of its range, but some populations from more northerly regions migrate southwards in autumn. It's a tall bird at over 1 metre with a 6-foot wingspan. Although often characterised as a silent stationary hunter, it can be a very vocal bird with a variety of calls, although the most commonly heard one is as follows. Although often only seen singularly, they form groups during the breeding season and build nests in trees, the groups being called heronries. Herons tend to revisit the same site each year. The grey heron has a slow, graceful flight, with typically bowed wings and with its neck pulled back into its body. Although they perch and nest in trees, they spend a lot of time on the ground too, especially when hunting. Herons hunt by canals, rivers, lakes and in wetlands, and although they primarily eat fish, they will also supplement their diet with rodents, lizards and small waterfowl. Although herons are quite a nervous bird, they are pretty much at the top of the food chain, in the UK at least. Like many predators though, they will avoid confrontation wherever they can, and will fly away if cats, dogs or foxes are around. That's not to say they wouldn't come back later, however. Herons hunt in 2 main ways. Firstly, by standing motionless next to shallow water on a rock, a bankside or branch, or standing still in shallow water, waiting for their prey to come near. Secondly, by slowly and stealthily stalking through shallow water, closing in on its prey. Some research has suggested that herons that are hunting and feeding successfully are more likely to use the motionless approach, while those birds that have been less successful, especially if younger, will spend more of the time hunting on the move. Herons have been shown to be reluctant to stand in water approaching or above 2 feet in depth, and rarely land from flight directly into water, preferring to land a little away from their hunting spot before then walking closer to the water itself. Herons will often identify new hunting spots from the air, and then land or perch some way away from it to watch for dangers or competitors. Herons that visit my pond will often land on the roof of a house across the road, then get closer and land on the next door's shed before, if confident enough, landing on the ground beside the pond, which fortunately I haven't seen them do for some time. So, with all that information, I then planned how best to protect my fish. My pond has some strengths and weaknesses in terms of making things harder for herons. Aside from the marginal shelf, which I'll come to in a minute, the water is at least 3.5 foot deep straight at the edge of the pond, meaning there's nowhere for the herons to stand in the water to hunt, and plenty of depth in which the fish can hide, as long as they spot the herons first. The marginal shelf is a problem area, however, at least during the winter and early spring when the plants have died back. It's then that herons can, and have, been able to walk on the baskets and take up their preferred hunting position. The rest of the year, the dense marginal plants make it really difficult for the herons to walk on the shelf, position themselves and then hunt. Although my water is generally quite clear, certainly clear enough for herons to spot fish in it, there's a fair amount of both aeration and filter returns to disturb the water across part of the surface of the pond, to make spotting fish a little harder. Additionally, the marginal plants provide a little cover and, more significantly, the plant that grows from the walled area also gives a fair amount of cover over the surface. But cover, marginal plants and water movement alone would do little to stop a determined and resourceful heron. So, to make things as safe as I can, I tried to put something in place to directly impact the heron's natural hunting behaviour. Specifically, I wanted to make it hard or impossible for them to get into a hunting position, rather than stop them being able to catch the fish after getting in position. So, the solution as I saw it was to put a barrier in the way between where they might land in the garden and the water's edge where they would hunt from. I already had a small net fence along the front of the pond to stop my cats from, well, making friends with the fish, and this would form the starting point to protecting the pond from herons. As I said, the marginal plants help to block the herons, so it made sense to reinforce them to both overcome their weaknesses, when they're dying back for instance, and to make the barrier they present more resilient. I therefore decided to continue the net fence around the pond, creating a barrier which would prevent herons from getting close to the water's edge. I had made it close enough to the water's edge and the marginal plants to stop them landing between the fence and the water, something they'd be reluctant to do anyway. When the plants are well grown each season, they do an okay job of hiding the fence, or at least minimising its visual impact. It doesn't block my view of the fish under normal circumstances, and it also provides a framework for hanging the leaf netting and the winter tarp from. Most importantly, although I've seen herons fly over my house, and I've seen them perch on the house across the road, in spite of monitoring the pond with a CCTV camera and a lot of working from home like many over the last almost 2 years, I've not seen a heron in my garden or of course near my pond, and I've not lost any fish, which is obviously the priority. So, negatives. It looks really rough. It was only really meant to be a temporary version, a proof of concept. But I've not got round to making an improved version, or even really deciding on what version that would be. There's an obvious weak spot too, on the right side by the wall. A clever or persistent heron could land on the wall and reach the margin above the shallower water, especially when the plants are at their shortest and thinnest. So far, they've not worked it out. And that's somewhat of a concern still. Herons are quite renowned for being persistent and clever, and with enough desperation and time, I'm not convinced they couldn't work out how to beat the fence. In spite of local herons clearly knowing the pond is there and that there's fish in it, they've not been able to get them. For me, as I said at the start, herons and other predators are part of the world we live in, that we've brought our pet fish into, and the best way to address the problem is to try to understand them as animals and to implement strategies to best overcome their natural behaviours, while making them also fit our particular ponds and preferences. Thanks so much for watching this episode of Keeping Water. In part 2 of Pond vs Predators, coming up at some point over the winter, I'll take a look at some other predators that put our fish at risk, one of which is much harder to manage. Please leave any thoughts and experiences you have in the comment section below. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time.